The engine that defined America wasn't born from freedom. It was stolen, stitched together, and sold as myth. What writers worship hides a history no company wants you to know. Miss it, and you'll never know the real story behind the roar you thought you understood. The Stolen Spark. The story of America's most iconic motorcycle engine does not begin in triumph, but in whispers of theft. Industrial espionage, secret sketches smuggled across borders, and engineers enticed with promises of riches laid the groundwork for what would one day roar across the highways as a symbol of freedom. To most riders, the V-twin's growl feels timeless, almost as if it was born from pure American soil. Yet buried in the archives is the darker truth. The original spark came from ideas that were not entirely homegrown. At the dawn of the 20th century, rival manufacturers were racing to harness combustion engines that could push motorcycles faster, farther, and louder. In this atmosphere of fierce competition, borrowing and stealing blurred into the same act. Stories circulated that early drafts of the American V-twin were suspiciously similar to designs already patented in Europe. Some claimed that employees who had worked in German factories carried blueprints in their suitcases when they crossed the Atlantic. Others alleged that meetings between executives and foreign engineers resulted in ideas quietly changing hands with little paperwork but plenty of handshakes. Whatever the exact method, the result was clear. What Americans would later celebrate as a symbol of independence had been born under the cloud of borrowed brilliance. One early writer from Ohio told of buying his first V-twin in 1915, believing the ads promised unmatched reliability. Within weeks, he was stranded on a country road with oil dripping onto his boots. For him, the disappointment wasn't just mechanical, it was the discovery that the promise of American craftsmanship already rang hollow. It is easy to see why this was buried. How could a company build national mythology on top of foreign influence? And yet, that is exactly what happened. The haze around its origin was only the beginning, because the first design choices revealed a willingness to gamble with truth and reliability, designs in the shadows. From the very beginning, the motorcycle engine that came to define American culture was tied to controversy. Engineers faced a choice: pursue originality at the cost of performance, or replicate what competitors had already refined. The decision was swift and ruthless. They embraced shortcuts, blending imported concepts with rushed innovations. What emerged was a motor that looked bold on the surface but was stitched together from pieces of other people's work. Patent filings became battlegrounds. Critics argued that certain dimensions of the early V-twin bore uncanny resemblance to European diagrams published years earlier. In an era when patent law was looser and enforcement patchy, the company moved quickly to register its claims before rivals could challenge them. For the average rider, these disputes meant little. They saw only a gleaming machine that promised speed and status. But within engineering circles, resentment brewed. Whispers of copying damaged credibility. Rivals muttered that American success was built not on ingenuity but on opportunism. It was a charge that would echo for decades. Worse still, the design decisions taken in haste often compromised reliability. Early adopters complained of oil leaks, rattling valves, and engines that overheated under long rides. These flaws were not accidents. They were the inevitable result of a strategy that valued market dominance over mechanical perfection. Yet instead of retreating, management doubled down. They polished the image, exaggerated the performance in advertisements, and declared the machine a symbol of originality. Those shortcuts set the stage for something more powerful than patents: the crafting of a myth that disguised compromise as genius. If you're hooked by how deep this history already runs, hit that like button. It tells us you want more stories uncovered. And drop a comment below. Do you think the engine's flaws were clever marketing or corporate deception? Your thoughts drive the conversation forward, and I want to hear every perspective. The engine that wasn't theirs. What makes a machine iconic? For the V-twin, it was never just horsepower or torque. It was narrative. From the 19-teens onward, the company told Americans that the engine was theirs, born in their land, reflecting their spirit. Posters declared it a triumph of homegrown innovation. Catalogs boasted of authentic American engineering. Writers bought into the story. roaring down open roads believing they carried a piece of national pride between their knees. But behind the curtain, insiders knew that the originality was questionable. Many of the engine's signature elements had foreign fingerprints all over them. The brilliance of the company was not in design purity, but in branding. They mastered the art of turning compromise into legend. A leaky motor was sold as high performance. A loud exhaust became the sound of freedom. Even the flaws were woven into identity, convincing riders that quirks were badges of authenticity rather than evidence of rushed engineering. And the myth worked. By the 1920s and 30s, the V-twin was less a machine than a symbol. To ride it was to declare allegiance to American independence, even if that independence was partly imagined. This myth-making was powerful, but it came at a cost. Once workers realized the truth behind the legend, tension brewed on the factory floor. They were asked to build machines wrapped in patriotic slogans, but plagued by fragile parts. Once the myth took hold, tension began to simmer inside the very factories that built it, as workers realized the legend did not match reality. The V-twin's roar may be myth, but keeping your bike alive isn't. That's why we've listed must-have rider gear and accessories in the description. Check them out before your next ride. Boardroom betrayal. The divide between leadership and labor is as old as industry itself, but in the case of America's most iconic motorcycle engine, it became especially toxic. Executives determined to protect the myth of originality silenced internal criticism. Engineers who questioned design flaws were brushed aside. Factory workers who warned about unreliable parts were told to increase speed, not quality. The boardroom demanded engines that could sell regardless of whether they could last. This betrayal of trust fostered resentment that would only deepen with time. Behind the glossy advertisements lay factories filled with disillusioned workers. Many were proud craftsmen who cared about building reliable machines. To them, the company's obsession with image over substance felt like a betrayal of their skill. They watched as executives courted investors with tales of patriotic engineering, even as they themselves struggled to assemble motors that often fell short of those promises. Each shortcut, each ignored warning widened the gap. What could have been a shared mission to build the finest motorcycle in the world became a battlefield of suspicion. The result was predictable. Loyalty eroded, quality slipped further, and the foundations of the brand's reputation began to crack. The irony is inescapable. An engine marketed as a symbol of unity and freedom was in truth dividing those who made it from those who sold it. The betrayal was not just technical but human. Workers felt abandoned and executives refused to listen. The silence from the top would not last forever. On the factory floor, frustration was already hardening into open defiance. Built to break, from the outside, the American V-twin seemed unstoppable. It rumbled with authority, shook the ground beneath it, and captured imaginations with its thunderous exhaust note. But underneath the chrome and noise lurked a troubling truth. The engine was built on compromises that made it distinctive yet unreliable. The design prioritized appearance and marketing appeal over durability. Engineers wanted a narrow angle between cylinders to give the bike its instantly recognizable profile, but that decision created cooling problems. Riders complained that the engine overheated during long summer rides, leaving them stranded on the roadside with smoking valves. Oil leaks became a notorious flaw. Some enthusiasts joked that if a Harley was not dripping oil, it was already empty. These quirks were romanticized in advertisements as character, but in reality they were symptoms of rushed engineering. Customers found themselves repairing machines that were barely broken in. Mechanics across the country developed a steady business not because the engines lasted, but because they failed so often. The contradiction was glaring. This was the engine that promised freedom and reliability, yet often left its riders in garages with greasy hands. Still, the company leaned into the myth rather than address the problems. It was a strategy that worked for marketing, but it placed unbearable strain on the men and women on the factory floor. Every flaw had a price, and the workers assembling those engines were the ones paying it with sweat and risk. When steel meets sweat. Inside the factories, the mythology surrounding the engine collided with harsh reality. Workers endured dangerous conditions, racing against production quotas that left little time for proper inspection or careful assembly. The roar of machinery filled cavernous halls, but so did the cries of exhaustion. Safety measures were often treated as optional. Fingers were lost to presses. backs strained under heavy casings, and fumes lingered in the air until lungs burned. For management, these workers were simply cogs in the greater machine of profit. Each unit completed was another promise fulfilled to dealerships and investors. But for the employees, the job was personal. Many came from families of craftsmen who valued precision and pride in their work. They knew when shortcuts were being taken, and they resented being forced to send out engines that they themselves would not trust on the road. Quality control teams were understaffed and overruled. Defects that could have been caught early were allowed to slide in the name of speed. These tensions boiled over in whispered conversations on the shop floor. Workers spoke of betrayal, of executives more concerned with glossy brochures than with the men staining their overalls in oil. The sense of unity that once existed between the builders and the brand was dissolving. Years later, another rider toured the Milwaukee factory and spoke with men on the line. One machinist pointed out a cracked casting about to be shipped and asked, "Would you trust that on the highway?" The rider admitted he already knew the answer. He'd broken down too many times because of flaws just like it. That rising resentment could not be contained inside factory walls. It erupted into strikes that shook the brand itself. Engines on strike. The clash between labor and leadership soon erupted into open conflict. Workers, no longer content with quiet grumbling, formed alliances with unions and staged strikes that rattled the very foundation of the company. These were not symbolic protests, they were battles for dignity. Production lines fell silent and dealerships waited in vain for shipments. Each strike meant fewer bikes on showroom floors and more angry customers demanding answers. Slowdowns became another weapon. Instead of halting work entirely, some crews intentionally reduced their pace, dragging out assembly times and exposing how dependent management was on their labor. The results were disastrous for the company's reputation. Engines that did leave the factory during these disputes often bore the scars of discontent. Improperly fitted gaskets, sloppy wiring, or parts that rattled loose within weeks. Riders noticed, and word spread. The brand's legendary aura of reliability, already fragile, cracked further under the weight of public disappointment. For management, strikes were an embarrassment. For workers, they were survival. The shop floor had become a battlefield where loyalty to the company was replaced by loyalty to one another. The roar of engines on the open road was being drowned out by chants from picket lines. Each chant outside the gates grew louder, while executives refused to acknowledge the storm that was closing in. Management's deaf ear. Instead of addressing grievances, management treated worker unrest as noise to be silenced. Executives dismissed safety complaints, ignored quality concerns, and publicly downplayed the strikes as minor inconveniences. But behind closed doors, panic grew. Investors worried about the effect on profits, while dealerships began to lose faith in the company's ability to deliver. Still, leadership refused to acknowledge its role in creating the mess. When engineers begged for more time to refine faulty parts, they were told delays were unacceptable. When workers asked for better conditions, they were accused of disloyalty. By silencing dissent, management deepened the resentment that had already taken root. What could have been resolved through negotiation instead hardened into bitterness. The gap between the boardroom and the factory widened until it felt like two different worlds. The consequences were devastating. Engines rolled off the line with flaws everyone could see but no one was allowed to fix. The men and women who built them took little pride in their work, knowing their warnings were ignored. Customers bore the brunt of this arrogance, paying for machines that broke down too soon. The company had not only betrayed its workers, it had betrayed its riders. The silence of management was not strength. It was negligence, and negligence in the face of rising global competition would soon push the company to the edge of collapse. With leadership blind to its own failures, the company stumbled forward unaware that a new wave of competition was about to hit. The Rebels soundtrack. The flaws of the American V-twin engine should have doomed it to obscurity, yet instead they helped elevate it into legend. The roar, uneven and raw, became the anthem of rebellion. Outlaw motorcycle clubs adopted the sound as their calling card, turning mechanical imperfection into cultural identity. The rough idle, the shuddering frame, the way the machine seemed to fight against smoothness, all of it spoke to riders who wanted to reject conformity. What others dismissed as poor engineering was embraced as authenticity. Movies and magazines amplified this myth. By the 1950s and 60s, images of leather-clad riders on rumbling Harleys appeared everywhere. The V-twin was not marketed as perfect, it was marketed as dangerous, masculine, and defiant. Young men who wanted to escape suburbia heard that sound and knew instantly that it symbolized freedom. Even the police, who hated the clubs that rode these bikes, admitted they could identify trouble long before they saw it, by the growl of that engine echoing through the streets. The irony was stark. An engine that leaked oil, overheated, and rattled its bolts loose was celebrated as the mechanical heart of freedom. It was rebellion sold in chrome and steel, and it worked. Riders felt that the flaws made the machine alive, almost human, like a loyal companion with quirks you could never quite tame. The roar was celebrated on the streets, yet inside the boardroom, survival depended on financial tricks as risky as the riders themselves. Freedom on credit. While the engine thundered across America's highways, the company's accountants struggled in silence. Beneath the roar of cultural success lurked financial fragility. By the late 1960s, management relied increasingly on risky financing to keep factories running. Credit lines were stretched thin, loans were taken at unfavorable rates, and debt mounted. Dealers were encouraged to flood showrooms with inventory financed on borrowed money. For a time, this gave the illusion of growth. Sales appeared strong, but much of it was propped up by credit rather than cash. This strategy came at a steep price. When consumer demand dipped, dealers were left holding unsold bikes and crushing debt. Many went bankrupt, leaving the company scrambling to maintain distribution networks. Meanwhile, executives reassured investors that the brand's cultural dominance made it untouchable. They failed to see how fragile their empire had become. A company that marketed freedom was increasingly chained to creditors. The rider's local dealer eventually folded under that very weight. Urged by the company to stock his floor with bikes on borrowed money, he was ruined when sales slowed. Customers like the Ohio rider were left traveling miles farther just to find parts, while the myth of freedom grew heavier with each payment missed. The contradiction could not have been sharper. Riders saw the V-twin as a symbol of independence, yet the corporation behind it was shackled by financial obligations it could not easily escape. One missed payment from a key dealer, one downturn in sales, and the house of cards risked collapse. Those fragile finances set the stage for a desperate redesign, an engine meant to save the company but destined to divide its loyalists. The Shovelhead Gamble. In 1966, the company introduced the Shovelhead, a new version of the iconic engine. It was supposed to be the savior, a redesign that would deliver more horsepower and restore faith in the brand. On paper, the improvements looked impressive. The Shovelhead offered stronger performance and sleeker styling, with rocker covers shaped like coal shovels giving the engine its distinctive name. Riders were told this was the future, a machine ready to reclaim lost glory. But reality quickly undercut the promise. The Shovelhead was plagued by many of the same problems that haunted its predecessors: oil leaks, overheating, and vibration. Worse, the push for higher performance created new headaches. Engines ran hotter, parts wore out faster, and maintenance demands increased. Loyalists who had tolerated flaws for decades began to question their devotion. For mechanics, the Shovelhead was both a blessing and a curse. It kept them busy, but it also damaged the company's reputation with each breakdown. Cultural loyalty bought the company time, but only so much. Riders were not blind. They saw smoother, more reliable machines coming from overseas and wondered why the American legend could not match them. The Shovelhead gamble was meant to save the brand, but instead it alienated a portion of its most faithful supporters. Disappointment over the Shovelhead grew sharper as new machines arrived from abroad, exposing just how vulnerable the American icon had become. Japan strikes back. By the early 1970s, Japanese manufacturers had begun their assault on the American market, and their timing was perfect. Companies like Honda, Yamaha, Suzuki, and Kawasaki unleashed motorcycles that were lighter, faster, and more reliable than anything coming out of Milwaukee. Riders who once swore allegiance to the American V-twin tested a Japanese machine and realized they could have performance without constant repairs. Honda's four-cylinder CB750, released in 1969, was described as the motorcycle that changed everything. It delivered smooth acceleration, reliable starts, and high-revving excitement at a price that undercut American models. Yamaha and Kawasaki piled on, flooding showrooms with machines that appealed to young riders uninterested in nostalgia. These bikes were not marketed as rebellion. They were marketed as precision, reliability, and fun. And they delivered. The American company suddenly looked old, slow, and out of touch. Cultural loyalty kept some riders on V-twins, but market share began to crumble. The Japanese strategy was relentless. Produce affordable, reliable machines in massive volumes and let word of mouth do the rest. Within a few years, they had turned the tables. The American giant that once defined motorcycle culture was now struggling to keep pace with rivals who treated reliability as a given, not a luxury. Global rivals had seized momentum, forcing the American company to decide whether reinvention was still possible or extinction was near. The evolution awakens. By the early 1980s, the company behind America's most iconic motorcycle engine was in freefall. Mounting debt, declining market share, and relentless competition from Japan had left it teetering on collapse. Factories that once roared with activity now echoed with uncertainty. For many, the end seemed inevitable. Yet in the darkest moment, a spark of resurrection appeared in the form of the Evolution engine, or the Evo as riders came to call it. Introduced in 1984, the Evo marked a turning point. Built for reliability, it featured aluminum heads to curb overheating, tighter tolerances to reduce leaks, and stronger parts for longevity. Riders tired of breakdowns were impressed. For the first time in decades, the V-twin's performance finally matched its myth. The Evo became more than an engine. It was a corporate lifeline. It allowed management to stabilize finances, reinvigorate dealerships, and rebuild trust with consumers. It did not erase the past, but it bought the future. The resurrection of the brand hinged on those cylinders firing cleanly and consistently. Revival in the factory was only part of the story. The true cultural rebirth was waiting in the glow of Hollywood's spotlight. Hollywood's motorcycle. If engineering saved the company's body, Hollywood saved its soul. The American V-twin had already been embraced by outlaw clubs, but cinema carried it into legend. In 1969, Easy Rider introduced the world to choppers with stretched forks and V-twin hearts. The film's images of freedom, rebellion, and the open road seared themselves into popular culture. From that point on, the sound of the engine was inseparable from the idea of liberty itself. Television and film amplified the myth. Police dramas showcased roaring gangs, while rock bands posed with Harleys as symbols of defiance. Even as engineering faltered, cinema elevated the brand. Hollywood transformed oil leaks into charisma, breakdowns into character, and unreliability into authenticity. Imperfection made the machine feel more real. For riders, this visibility was intoxicating. Buying a bike was no longer just about transportation, it was about joining a story larger than themselves. They were not simply customers, they were actors in an ongoing American epic. The power of film transformed the V-twin from a machine into a myth, and myths do not rust easily. While screens turned flaws into legend, the workers who built the machines carried scars that refused to fade. The ghosts of labor. Long after the Evo's success and Hollywood's celebration, the ghosts of labor still haunted the company. The strikes, the unsafe conditions, the ignored warnings, none of these vanished with new paint or better castings. Workers remembered, and unions carried their grievances into negotiations that stretched across decades. For every advertisement about freedom, there was a worker who remembered losing a finger to a press or inhaling fumes in poorly ventilated halls. Union contracts became battlegrounds. Workers demanded wages and safety to atone for past betrayals. Management occasionally yielded, yet resentment lingered. Even in prosperous times, mistrust clung like smoke after a burnout. Laborers knew they built the culture and legends, yet also knew they had been treated as expendable far too often. This tension shaped the company's future. Labor disputes influenced production schedules, slowed new model rollouts, and kept management cautious. The myth of unity between rider and machine was always shadowed by division between boardroom and factory. Those divisions may not have made it onto posters or movie screens, but they left marks just as permanent. Even with those wounds unhealed, the engine's voice carried forward, echoing into a new century with meaning far beyond mechanics. We've uncovered betrayal, struggle, and survival, and there's still one chapter left. If you've stayed with me this far, make sure you subscribe right now. That way you'll never miss when we dig into hidden histories and the truths corporations would rather bury. Hit subscribe because the final roar is coming next. The roar that won't die. Today, the American V-twin remains one of the most recognizable engines in the world. It is more than a piece of machinery. It is a cultural emblem. The roar echoes not just on highways, but in politics, in fashion, and in debates about what it means to be American. To some, the sound represents independence and working-class grit. To others, it symbolizes nostalgia for a country that no longer exists. In every case, it carries weight far greater than the sum of its parts. Global competition has not disappeared. Japanese manufacturers still dominate on price and performance, and European brands compete on prestige and technology. Yet the American engine occupies its own space. Less a rival in specifications, more a relic turned icon. Investors see it as proof that myth can sustain profit. Politicians see it as a prop to signal solidarity with ordinary citizens. Consumers see it as a chance to buy a slice of freedom, even if that freedom comes with quirks and compromises. The legacy of espionage, betrayal, strikes, and reinvention lives within every rumble of the V-twin. It is a machine that embodies both the best and worst of American industry, ingenuity mixed with arrogance, pride blended with pain. And still, despite it all, the engine refuses to die. It roars on, not just as transportation, but as a mirror held up to the nation itself. The story of America's most iconic motorcycle engine is not finished. It never will be, as long as that roar continues to echo across the open road. The roar lives on. Subscribe today, join the ride, and never miss the truths they never wanted you to hear.